bring up our panel tonight. We've got a great group of filmmakers, starting with composer David Fleming. Editor and executive producer Paul Crowder. Producer Margaret Cody. And director Ron Howard. Jim Henson is so obvious, it really comes through in the movie. And I'm kind of curious, I guess my first question is just, for each of you, what was your relationship to Henson and his work coming into this? Were you fans, or was it something that you grew to love over the course of making this movie? Sesame Street is so deeply ingrained in my psyche. I think I was, accidentally brainwashed by my parents the first couple of years. So that would be the main one, but Muppets, of course.
Without a doubt. I mean, I think we all grew up learning to count and learning to spell using the Muppets. I certainly did. And I have those long memories of those songs that are all the counting songs. So it was huge. And the Muppets were just, when I was a teenager, just right on my comedy, like funny mood all the time. So they were fantastic without that.
Same. Big fan. Super, like, obsessed with Sesame Street, and especially all the films. And I didn't know it at the time. I wasn't thinking like, oh, Jim Henson made all these films. But like all of the interstitials in the counting films, and the two little girls, and the King of Eight. Just so, yeah, totally big fan.
I'm a little older than these guys, so for me, I now recognize that it was Jimmy Dean and Rolf that was the first Jim Henson character that I was aware of, but I had no idea it was Jim Henson. And then along came Sesame Street, and that was incredible to me. But now I'm starting to raise kids, so they're tiny, they're little, and I realized that I was engrossed by those films, and I by then Jim was beginning to be famous, and I knew there was this Jim Henson and Muppets, and they were amazing, and Big Bird, and all the Kermit. But what would happen is I would be walking around, and I would see one of these counting films, and I would get engrossed in Sesame Street and admire it, and then sit down with Bryce and watch and get caught up in Sesame Street. And it wasn't until I was working on this that I realized that not only did he contribute to puppets, but of course he's helped design this aesthetic. And what really blew me away as we were working on the film was that this was a result of all of this experimentation from the time he was a teenager. And that sense of humor, and that experimental sort of visual sense, and all of that stuff was informing Sesame Street. And then of course, the Muppets were an amazing phenomenon.
Yeah, I think for me that was one of the great things about this documentary is even as a fan of Jim Henson, it really made me aware of what a great filmmaker he was. I always thought he was like a performer, a puppeteer, maybe a writer, but it's like realizing what a great director he was. I'm curious, what were the origins of this documentary? How did it come to you, and what was the starting point?
Well, Justin Wilkes, who's president at Imagine, Sarah Bernstein, who runs documentaries, came to me, 2 years ago? A little over 2 years ago? And basically said, the Henson family they're reluctant to turn over their archives and cooperate, and yet their word is that they're beginning to believe maybe now is the time to really do a comprehensive documentary. And they're interested in talking to people. Would you want to talk to them? And I certainly thought that would be great. I've loved what's happened with Imagine and documentary filmmaking. I've enjoyed it for myself. I think it's not only exciting, I think it informs my scripted work, and in important ways, work with Paul a lot on various projects, and it's exciting. So yeah, I went in but I had no idea really what would the feature story be. You know, I just knew it was incredible. I knew my friend George Lucas characterized him as a bona fide creative genius. And so I had a lot of admiration. But as soon as we started seeing the archives, and I was talking to the family, I recognized there were like 3 levels on which this film could work. We could celebrate the stuff that we knew. We could discover all this stuff that was sort of the foundation of it and more, and the ups and downs sort of in terms of what succeeded and what didn't and what that meant to him. But then there was this family story underneath it. And of course, that's always a subject that interests me, behind the scenes, behind the world of people who get a lot done on a human level. What does it mean? How does that reverberate? And when I realized they were frank and open and interested, and yet very, very loving. I just felt like there was a chance to really offer audiences some real insight beyond celebrating, all the great stuff, which was worthy in and of itself.
So Margaret, at what point did you come on board, and what about this appealed to you?
I came on board, I would say about 2 years ago now. It was maybe like March or April of
COVID.
2022.
That's like COVID.
And I had worked with Ron and Justin and Sarah on a documentary about David Johansen. Thank you, we love it. And we just really enjoyed working together, and it was just conversations about other projects. And when Justin asked me about this, I just was like, that would just be amazing. I mean, the idea of a documentary about Jim Henson, directed by Ron, and just working with that team again was really enticing. And one of the things that was so cool was just and really exciting was when we went to LA and we were with Lisa and Brian Henson, and they were screening all this early film. It's really early archive, and it had been so well restored, and it was just so entertaining. And Ron, I remember you were it was starting to be really clear that you wanted to take what Jim had created and let that inform the style of the film. And that was just, I think, always very at the forefront of your thinking about it. Seemed like,
Yeah, well, that's true. And I first of all, I was just laughing my way through all of this stuff. But I was also fascinated by his experimental films, his own journey through his brain. I'm an idea man, that's kind of where the title came from. But also, of course, timepiece. And I recognized that, of course, there's a paradox at work. He's playful, he's joyful, he loves life, he's an optimist, all these things, and yet he feels this anxiety, this battle against time, which he reflects in his film. But he lived it, he lived it. And so I felt like here's a film that could be both optimistic and yet also utterly human, and revealing in really interesting ways. And and the family, they were willing to trust us with this. Last night on a panel, Brian said that after our conversations, they said, "Oh, he reminds us of Dad. That's how you do it," which was, of course, supreme flattery.
Well, that point you made about kind of the way this movie is, it's hopeful and it's idealistic, but also very realistic and not overly sentimentalized. I mean, that's another thing I really liked about it. And I'm curious, in terms of the score, how does that kind of writing that line inform your approach to the music? Yeah, it was, Ron brought up timepiece before, and I think that was a really interesting sort of clue into how to approach this, because, as Ron alluded, he sort of was really an experimental filmmaker, but that piece, and specifically kind of how Ron and Paul have kind of framed it, sort of shows how obsessed with time he was and how much he wanted to get done. So for me, what was interesting really is how to try to express that kind of march, that battle against time, and the clock is always ticking for him, but then there's also, there's these moments where he, especially when he confronts mortality, where we kind of, pull the rug out and stop time and stop the clock. So it really became about like, when do we show how he's dealing with that? Because he really is, this mix of ambition and wanting to get everything done, and then there's this sort of like quiet spirit at the center of it. So with the music, it was always focusing on what part of Jim is coming out right now. Is this the spiritual side of him, or is this the driven side? And driven by playfulness and joy, which is also the interesting thing about him, I think. So many of these types of stories of these types of guys are driven aggressively, and he's driven by playfulness. So that was something I always wanted to tap into.
I just also gotta say, what an ambitious score for a documentary, because there were so many. They really came through, but the thing about documentaries, unlike scripted, as you all know, is that it's this ongoing evolution. Like right up until maybe a month or 6 weeks ago, we were still getting photographs and ideas and little bits of sound, things that we could use, and some tracks. And one of the things that was so important to all of us was Jane's presence in the film, and she was so reticent about being interviewed that it was really a challenge. And very late in the game, we got some photographs actually from Lisa Henson that she had taken as a teenager that she found, and it was very helpful. But one of the last things that you did was actually a sort of a Jim and Jane idea that wound up, to me, it just elevated, everything. So there were so many dimensions in what you had to do.
Well, I think Jane's part of the story was for me the most surprising. I think Jim is so interesting because everyone obviously has seen so much of his work, and in some ways it seems like we know him through that work. And I think in some ways that is correct, that there is so much of him in that. But then there's also all these things that were completely surprising to me, and I think his relationship with his wife was sort of paramount there. Yeah, and that was one of the things that kind of snuck up on me watching the movie when it ends up becoming as much about that as it is. And Paul, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the evolution of that, because Ron kind of alluded to the fact that it was something that was maybe discovered a little later in the game, how important that relationship was to the movie.
But without a doubt, I think Ron was always pushing for it. That was always the thing that Ron was asking for. It's like, can we get more Jane? Can we get a little deeper? Can we always find the deeper thing? Because there's so much fun stuff to be had. There's so much playful things that you could do. But where the stories, where we all connect, is those emotional stories where we can all relate because we can relate to something that's similar in our lives. So it was trying to find those moments. The most difficult thing about the Jane situation, as Ron has said, she didn't do many interviews, that the quality of the audio that we had was so poor because they were done for books or articles, so they were on a dictaphone on the coffee table. There was no close miking. What became to our advantage was this the AI side of things, where they were able to clean this stuff up in the last 3-4 months beyond anything we'd heard throughout. Every time we were playing back the film, that was always the tricky part. It's like, can we get Jane louder? How can we make sure she doesn't get lost? So then suddenly the technology came on that side, and that was really, really helpful to be able to use more of her interview. And then we found there was one more interview came up very late, and suddenly kicked in a bit more stuff. These photographs came in, and when Jane's that final edit, like right in the end that Sierra and I did, where we got Jane figured in a lot bigger, and suddenly she was just that little bit extra, it made all the difference. And it was suddenly, we all had the same reactions, like, oh my God, here we are, this is what we've been missing, this is the bit of the film that's been missing that we really, really needed. So yeah, it's great.
Well, you mentioned, Ron, that a documentary is constantly evolving and the shape is constantly changing. Where do you begin? I mean, do you start with the interviews? Do you start digging through archival footage? Are you kind of doing it all at once? What's the starting point of the actual filmmaking process?
Well, it's kind of all at once, and there's a lot of research done. And Mark Monroe is a writer for a reason, because he goes through that and but it is helping guide a narrative, and which influences the questions that we begin to ask. So a lot of that work goes on before you sort of invest the time and money and energy in interviews. And so that was very important here. But the thing that I've had to learn, that all the documentary veterans, they kind of make fun of me, because always about halfway through I'm saying, is there, what is it? And they're just like, we're fine, we're doing what we need to do. And it is collecting these from the archives, from the interviews, these buckets, and then figuring out, how the structure is going to work, where the cause and effect is, and the narrative push. And I'm so used to that sort of being in place from the beginning, because there's a screenplay you followed and you've shot it for those reasons. But one of the things that I really have also come to appreciate about the doc world and the discipline of it is it's a slightly different relationship with an audience. I mean, you always want to hold people's attention and be engrossing, but with scripted, it is more sit down and tell a story, transport people, use cinema in a way. It's a little more theatrical. I mean, in a way, it's artifice, and maybe the effect is to feel dramatically like it's real, and but we all know this is something that's totally controlled and made, and audiences expect to be really taken on a ride and just show me and let me hear, what have you got? With documentaries, they're there because they're intellectually they want to understand, and with movies, that can be a value. It can even be an entertainment value, but first and foremost, they want this diversion. They want to go on a journey. When you're talking to a documentary audience and you're working for them, it's really what can you tell me? What can I learn from this? And please make it as entertaining as you possibly can. Sure, but it's a different kind of relationship with the audience, and I've really enjoyed understanding those differences. And again, as I say, I understand why Margaret's worked with many times, or Spike Lee, or Jonathan Demme, or others who move back and forth between these disciplines. Like Marty says, they're all films to him, and I'm beginning to understand why he says that. But it's definitely very enriching and exciting. I'm really grateful that I've kind of found this, and this is something that I can, especially with the support of Imagine, can continue finding subjects that are interesting along